Okay. Let me see if I can hear myself. Yes. All right. We are live. Thanks everybody for joining us today for our first bout of Gatsby office hours. We'll be doing accessibility today, or Marcy and Rachel will be talking about accessibility. So if you have any questions, please do let us know. Our plan is to do like an office hours every week, and accessibility will be like part of the rotation. So yeah, with that, Marcy and Rachel, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcy Sutton here to talk about accessibility with Rachel Cherry. Say hi, Rachel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is exciting.
Yeah, today we've sort of a different format than I've done before, the office hours. So it's free flowing and more of a conversation and kind of exploration of whatever comes to mind with accessibility. Given your background, though, Rachel, I'm thinking WordPress might be a
Yeah.
good space for us to talk about. Can you tell us about what kind of work you do and yeah, how do you work with Gatsby?
Yeah, so I hold several hats or wear several hats. By day, I am the director of WP Campus, which is an organization for people that use WordPress in higher education. And it's a great community, and we hold a couple conferences a year. We actually have one coming up that I'm sure we'll talk about. And we also have a big focus on accessibility. For my other hat, I am a freelance software engineer who generally is hired by organizations to come in and remediate their accessibility problems. And if they don't have the resources to help, to audit their accessibility problems, and they don't have the resources to actually perform remediation. I also do a lot of custom WordPress development work as well. So lots of history with WordPress and accessibility. I've been working in both fields since about I'd say like 2008, 2011 maybe was when I got started with WordPress in higher education. If, for those familiar with higher education web development, it's accessibility is a pretty common topic. We usually fall under Section 508 responsibilities, and so it's common in our WP campus community for a reason, because majority of people that work in our space, accessibility is a job responsibility, and so lots of creative solutions, lots of great conversations, lots of passion for making accessible web products. So it's a great space.
That's awesome. And you mentioned Section 508. Can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of what the goal of that is in terms of impact on students
Yeah.
and
So
faculty, I imagine too.
yeah. So Section 508 is pretty much the only legislation that we have in the United States for for protecting uh, technology for those with disabilities. And basically, what it means is that any kind of technology, from websites to printers, have to meet certain standards. It, and you fall under the Section 508 basically if you're a government agency of any kind. So it's an interesting space in the higher ed space, and that technically not everyone falls under that. It's I'm not a lawyer in this matter, so I can't necessarily speak down to the dotted details of who falls underneath it, but um, we do generally fall underneath it in higher ed, and we do have that responsibility. And it is quite common for the higher ed space to get OCR complaints, which is the Office of Civil Rights. And so it's unlike the general business space um, of websites and pretty much any other general website. Higher education websites are more likely to be bound to these standards and require that their websites be accessible. And it in turn provides, it kind of goes really hand in hand with the mission of higher education, which is to provide information and education for anyone who wants it. And so you can't really do that unless you have accessible resources. And so if you have ever worked on a higher education campus, you're also familiar with Office of Disability Services that most, if not all, higher education institutions have, which their aim is really more for kind of in-person experiences. For example, if someone can't access a building, they would help them with that. If someone needs certain resources in order to attend a class, they need a signer, an interpreter, or they need Braille resources, they would go to the Office of Disability Services. And so there's a whole similar space for any kind of technology and online resources, and that's for Section 508.
Got it. So, how does WordPress and Gatsby kind of fit into your work in higher education?
Yeah, so WordPress is obviously a pretty popular CMS. It's really heavily used in higher education along with other CMSs like Drupal. And a big reason for that is um, I always kind of describe higher ed as enterprise on a budget in the sense that you are creating very enterprise-like tools in the sense that you have to, what you usually see in higher education are these small teams of people. There are bigger teams, but that's more rare. Usually you'll have like an office of like 2 to 5 people. I was always a team of one, and you're responsible for managing extreme amounts of websites, if not the entire campus or large colleges. And there's only so much 2 to 5 people can really do. So you need tools like content management systems to help you manage content, and WordPress and others like Drupal are really great tools for that, because they do give you the power to set up a platform, manage the tools, whether that's themes or plugins, and you know pass off a little bit of that responsibility that you can't handle from 2 to 5 people onto large amounts of content editors spread out, to the subject matter experts that are wanting to publish blogs and their research, to the um, department manager for biology so that they can keep the biology website up to date, things like that. So it's important to if accessibility is important to you, then it's also important to have tools that are accessible. And so this is where you have folks like the accessibility team at WordPress Core who do a lot of work in that regard, and you know you you have tools like Gatsby that could help come in as well. And it's really great to see all the work that Gatsby's been doing for accessibility to make sure their tool is accessible for folks in higher ed that might could use that as well. So um, I have the WordPress accessibility space has some work to do. Um, there's lots of history there, but there are a lot of people that are involved in the community itself that really care about accessibility and are really trying. There's been a lot of progress made with Core recently over the last year due to the audit that was done. We could talk about that a little bit. And there's definitely a lot of room to go, a lot of progress that still needs to be made. There's pretty much very little to no effort done to try and help slash educate slash enforce accessibility in any of the themes or plugins, which is a huge problem and makes it a really big struggle. So yeah, lots of room to go, but I think they'll get there eventually, if slowly but surely. Especially when you have as many people involved as they do with the core team, the accessibility team at least, really fighting and really pushing to make sure the product is more and more accessible.
Yeah, there is definitely the challenge with the ecosystem. Really, I mean, it's true in Gatsby as well that starters and UI frameworks that you might pull off the shelf have to be evaluated for accessibility. And some of them might even say they have accessibility, but do they really? So we got a question in the chat that I think is fertile ground for discussion in this area. From Andrew Litchford, he asked, do you have a specific QA process to ensure your accessibility is up to stuff when launching a website? And he says, love that you're talking about WordPress and Gatsby. He's been in WordPress for years and is new to Gatsby. So considering both on the WordPress kind of plugin side and Gatsby's same sort of issue, we are responsible to evaluate the accessibility of these tools that we're using. So can you talk a little bit about your process for ensuring quality when it comes to accessibility?
Yeah, I use a wide variety of tools and mixed in with my experience. So probably what I'll do first is usually use some auditing tools that will scan. For example, there's a good variety, and it's exciting to see a lot of these tools getting better and better lately, and like a lot of work's being done in that space. So there's the Axe tool, which they have a browser extension that's pretty nice. There's WebAIM, which is a tried and true, and they just got a big upgrade done on their tool. But that tool actually came out of higher education, which is really great to see. Or at least it came out of a university department. So yeah. Microsoft recently came out with one that's not bad called Accessibility Insights, which is really in depth and kind of walks you through a lot of things. It shows you some problems it finds, but then it gives you a nice checklist of things to double check. So I recommend that one as well. But the thing to keep in mind with a lot of these tools is that they're not perfect. They're only going to find a certain percentage of actual problems, because really all they're doing for the most part is scanning your HTML. So, which is a big portion of it, in the sense that a certain percentage of accessibility problems can be discovered via bad HTML or invalid markup. And so these tools are scanning for invalid markup. They're scanning your document structure to make sure your headings are in order and things like that. They can scan image tags to make sure they have alt attributes, and so they can scan, A elements to make sure they have valid href attributes, things like that. But that can only get you so far, because then a lot of as flexible as the web is, which is really great for a lot of things, the flexibility can make it really easy to create problems. Like a very common example is the idea that, like, you can add a div to your HTML and then throw in some JavaScript that makes the div clickable. Um, the problem being is that divs aren't interactive elements. And while that on-click ability will work great with a mouse, it won't work for those who can't use a mouse and are reliant on other technology or a keyboard. So accessibility scanners aren't generally going to catch that problem. So in comes manual testing. And so what I like to do is not touch my mouse and use a keyboard to navigate the page, see if there's any problems, see if I fall into keyboard trap, or I can't actually activate a button, or something that looks like a button, but it's not actually a button as far as HTML is concerned, which is another common problem. So definitely do some keyboard testing, and then I do screen reader testing. So I have a Mac, and so I generally use VoiceOver. If you have a Windows, there are a few more screen reader options for you, which is nice. And I will let the screen reader interact with the page for me, and see if I can discover any problems through that method. So that's generally my test. I also like the accessibility tree, which is accessible easily in Firefox, and that kind of gives you a general idea of your. It's a great indicator of labeling and making sure things are labeled. So yeah, that's my general path, and it's going to give me a good idea of how things are going. If nothing glaring pops up from that, then you're probably in a good space. Definitely maybe see if some big elements that are really great to test at first are like, does your website have any forms? Forms are one of the more complex things to make accessible, and so definitely give those a test and make sure you have proper labeling. Really common things that I see a lot is really invalid labeling, if they even have it at all. Um, Error validation, things like that. When you submit the form and you come back, is there messaging that the form was submitted and all as well? Things like that. That if you don't have that visual context, what are you missing from the experience? And so I know that for a lot of sighted developers, it's 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 a whole different mindset to get into about we and I include myself in that. I am fully sighted. When I consume a web page, I consume it very visually, but I have to think about what it's like for anyone who does not consume my content visually and what that experience is like and what I can do to make that better. So getting into that mindset really helps a lot too.
Yeah, great point about forms. There's so many forms on websites. And yeah, my typical process is use the keyboard. Like, don't use your mouse or your trackpad. Can you reach and operate everything that's interactive that a mouse user can do? Either using the same controls, which is what we call, interactive user interface components. Is there some way to accomplish the same task, whether or not, you have the exact same affordance is a fancy word we like to use for that. But I love browser extensions too, because those you can run, like say you're looking at a starter or theme, something that gives you functionality that you can roll into your site and kind of get up and going quicker. Demo sites for those projects are usually what I test first before I make the commitment to downloading source code and playing with it. I will go and evaluate a demo site. And that can give me a pretty good picture of what accessibility problems exist. And if I'm feeling generous with my time, I ideally would do it all the time, but let's be honest, I don't always have the time to go and file an issue against the, whatever project I'm looking at. If it's got some accessibility issues with it, I really try to file an open source issue if I can, because that way it'll get fixed and somebody else can benefit in the future. It's kind of the beauty of open source. But commercially, I mean, paying money for something that's not accessible happens way too frequently, and we should have a higher bar for quality. So drop people a message if you're like, I can't procure this product because it's not accessible. Tell them. I mean, money talks. So there's kind of the open source free side, but there's also this commercial side, especially if you're, building sites for universities or businesses. That user impact at the end of the day is really what we're aiming for, kind of regardless of the legal situation. Um, but yeah, the accessibility testing approach, you can kind of get a good picture just of the like low hanging fruit issues. So things like color contrast, as Rachel mentioned, forms, image alt text. So there's kind of the site Chrome, the things around the layout of the site that are sort of repeated on multiple pages. But I guess in the CMS space, there would also be the content areas where maybe you have content folks that are putting in images and headings. And so having some sort of checklist or guidelines for your content folks so that they're not unknowingly adding inaccessible content onto the site, that would be an important aspect of working with WordPress or Drupal or any CMS. We have gotten two more questions. One was about building accessibility into a single page app more than a traditional web page, which, as we get into Gatsby and sites using JavaScript frameworks, doing things like managing tab index can be important. And I did drop a link to a previous live stream that I recorded on building a Gatsby site for accessibility, and that will go into a bit more on interactive user interfaces including like what Gatsby gives you for free, um, kind of what tools and processes to use if you are evaluating starters and plugins and all that sort of thing. So I would point you to that. So we can try and keep a little bit of a focus today on WordPress because we got another really great question that Rachel, I'd love to hear your input on. Kishba's school is considering a switch to WordPress as a CMS, and they're hoping it's their chance to adopt Gatsby in front of it. And they say it's not necessarily accessibility related, but could you speak to what life is like at a school, college, or university with Gatsby in front of WordPress? So it's that idea of using WordPress as a headless CMS, and the front end is using Gatsby. So can you talk a little bit about that intersection and kind of? I'd love to hear, what about Gatsby you felt was like, yes, I'm going to go use this.
Yeah, so I about 6 months ago actually went down the decoupled WordPress with Gatsby path, and I'm super excited that I did. I can't remember when I started, kind of getting involved and playing around with Gatsby, probably a few months before that. So maybe like fall of last year, I don't remember. But for me, I started getting involved and noticing Gatsby and experimenting with it because I was very excited by the organization's position on accessibility and, actually hiring people that care about it and work on it and things like that. And in our space, that's kind of rare. And so for those of us who do a lot of accessibility work, you want to support those organizations, right? You want to work with those people. So that's why I started getting interested in Gatsby. And then earlier this year, we were redesigning the WP campus website. And I've had this website since the organization started in like 2015. This It had gone a couple of design iterations, but we hadn't redesigned it since maybe the last time it got into its current or its last state, which was probably 2016, when we grew enough to get more than like a landing page design kind of stuff. And so it needed it really badly. It needed a new design. It needed a new information architecture. It was we had outgrown it a long time ago. We'd outgrown the menu design, things like that, and had a lot more content. So it needed a lot of help. And I decided that we would use this opportunity to decouple from our WordPress front end and move to Gatsby. So there's a lot of reasons for that. The ones mentioned. It's always great to have opportunities to learn something new and experiment. A lot of folks that our entire organization is all volunteers. And if you've ever worked in higher ed, and as I've kind of mentioned, you wear many hats. You usually have, like I was a team of one for a majority of my time full time in higher education. And I designed the website, I built the website, I did Q&A, I managed the content, I corralled the content editors, I did it all. So all that to say, you don't have tons of time. So any opportunity that I can give to folks in our group who wanted to help to have an opportunity to play with new toys and learn something new was one reason. And so we had tons of fun. The other reason is as a WordPress developer who's been around long enough, I was getting increasingly frustrated with performance. And I also come at this from a place of I like to be really in control of my websites, and I like to know what's going on all the time. So a problem in the CMS space, I'm sure this isn't just to WordPress. I'm sure Drupal might have, I don't know. I won't speak for Drupal. WordPress has a problem where you can add all these plugins, and uh, you're not quite always sure what they're doing. They're running code all the time, unless you just dive down into the code for every single plugin. The problem that I was having a lot was, I'd have a plugin. For example, I had a gallery plugin, and we used it on one page in order to like show a gallery of our swag items. Like that was it. But the gallery plugin enqueued its CSS and JavaScript file on every page of the website. It's just like, "Urgh." And that was really common. Basically, any plugin that does front end functionality would not add logic to only include that when it's needed. And so our homepage, when I flipped the switch, I documented it. Our homepage alone had 20 CSS files that it didn't need on the homepage, and about the same amount of JavaScript files that it did need that were running. And that kind of stuff is really frustrating. And so the allure of decoupling was really the reality that I need a content management system to manage my content. So like if you're in higher education, as I mentioned earlier, you need a CMS because that's the only way you're going to get the content managed by, every single user that's spread out all over campus. So you need all that, but you don't need it to actually also do the front end, especially in, as we're getting all these new tools, like things like Gatsby and other ways to really easily decouple. You can explore new worlds and use you know use tools that are better meant for the front end, that are more performant. And something that I really like about the Gatsby experience is that I have super control. Like I tell Gatsby exactly what I want on every page, and there's not there's not plugin functionality happening when I don't want it to happen. So once we were finished, you can go see our website. It's www.wpcampus.org. That is our Gatsby front end. And it's really fast, and it was really fun to build. And this touches on a similar related note, and kind of also tying the WordPress um, decoupled experience together, is that, as I mentioned earlier in the WordPress space, there are still some struggles with accessibility. And basically it's really hard to find plugins that are accessible. I rarely actually use plugins that do front end functionality because it is really hard to impossible to find plugins that create front end markup that care about accessibility. And when you do find them, it's great. I'm super loyal to them. For example, I'm a big fan of Gravity Forms. I'm not gonna reinvent wheels like building my own form builder. So it's nice to have the groups that actually invest in making their product accessible like they do. So we still use them. But otherwise, we custom build almost everything because we place such a priority on accessibility, and that's pretty much the only way we can do it. And so this comes into, again, in the notion of, well, if we're building all our own custom functionality on the front end anyway, then we don't have to do it within the WordPress application because we can do it over here in Gatsby. So one of the caveats of decoupling WordPress is that you you can't generally use plugin functionality on the front end. You're going to lose some of that out of the box stuff, like markup, front end markup. If you're using WordPress core at all to do front end markup and things like that, you might lose that functionality. And so if you're like someone like us who write it all ourselves anyway, that's not a problem. But if you are someone who heavily depends on plugins to do front end markup, then it's not impossible, but it's going to be more of a challenge. You might have to invest a little bit more time to also decouple yourself from um, that functionality and find the different solution, or figure out how to replicate that HTML. Um, there are some things you can do, that there are some things you can try and experiment with, but yeah, it's important to keep that kind of stuff in mind. Also, things like user authentication and stuff like that, you have to get a little more creative. We actually implemented single sign-on functionality, and that's definitely more of an advanced kind of area of development. So, think about stuff like that and how that might affect the transition. But we're we're super pumped that we did it, and we love it, and it's a great setup, and it gives us a whole new playground where we can much easier try out all kinds of different tools, and have a whole new place to kind of explore modern development, things like that.
That's so cool that it's working for you. Sort of along those lines with decoupling and how in WordPress, you get instant previews. How are you working to sort of make sure that experience isn't broken for content writers so that you can preview your work? I'm sort of leading to an answer. I want to hear what your solution is, and then I can add the Gatsby way of doing that. But yeah, how are you sort of doing that collaborative content work with Gatsby?
So right now we're not. That's something on my list. I have my own solution to build that out for. So like right now, when you edit, when you go and you log into the WordPress application to edit content, there's no preview mechanism. Technically, you could preview it in the old WordPress theme that's accessible if you're logged in as an administrator. But no, I'm sorry but no, that's not something we do right now. It's on my list. It was just lower on their priority list than other things happening right now. So we haven't figured that out, but or we haven't set it up. I know how to do it. I know how to set it up to get it working. I just haven't done it yet.
Yeah. So for some organizations, it's nice that you were able to get away with it, not being a blocker. But I know for a lot of teams, having that peace of mind to see how is this content going to render on the website is super important, and people feel like they can't do their jobs without that kind of that feedback loop of seeing it in draft form and be able to preview it. So the Gatsby Cloud um, product, it's free for personal sites. There's some other tiers of amounts that you can sign up for, but that will replace some of that preview functionality and builds. So that's a big piece of this kind of decoupling conversation, is having some sort of functionality that will allow you to preview content. There is an open source way to create a preview server, so you can roll your own solution there a bit. And I'll go find a link to that in the open source docs. But that's where Gatsby Cloud comes into it, to be able to preview your content. And sort of along those lines, we got a question from Todd Libby. Are there any plugins that can help with content as far as accessibility goes? So for the content editor who would be wanting this collaborative experience, to try and get that accessibility stuff right before you even try to go preview it. Have you worked with any kind of content checkers in WordPress? I know of some, but I'm curious if you've run into that.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of limbo space right now in this because there's Gutenberg and um, Gutenberg's accessibility aside, it has some stuff that will check some stuff, but I don't really know of any plugins that try to extend that and make it check Gutenberg. But I do know that there are a couple of checkers. I'm gonna look up one right now because I can't think of the name of it. Um,
I think there was one
learning.
for CK Editor, but I don't know if that's used in WordPress.
I don't think it is. The NC State Accessibility Helper plugin is pretty good. I think he's still running that, but maybe he isn't. There is WP Accessibility, which is definitely still being managed by Joe Dolson, and that's supposed to be really helpful for WordPress accessibility. Um, I have an old plugin that I should probably just adopt out to somebody called Wally, but that's not really necessarily for editing. Um, so I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately, because there's not tons of options, and I'm sure a lot of people were probably putting a lot of that on hold anyway because of all the Gutenberg stuff that happened, and kind of Gutenberg is an ever changing target right now. So um, unfortunately, there's not a great answer for that. You just kind of, I think the best thing that you really can do if you do have a lot of content editors is to come up with checklists and education. Honestly, it's like, in my experience, education and communication is really important. Making people really mindful of at least, like, a 4 to 5 top common problems, like image alt attributes and heading structure. Um, Another big, really common in the university I work with is, like, the vague link text, like read mores and click here's, stuff like that. Helping coming back to what I was saying earlier, but helping people be mindful that not everyone consumes visually and what that's like. And so that's why it's important to have more context in your links and be more verbose sometimes with your language. So that's really kind of, honestly, the one of the easiest, best things you can do for a lot of people, especially in higher education. There are scanning and reporting services that also help a lot. There are things like Site Improve and other similar tools that will basically scan your websites all the time and give you reports of problems that it finds, things like that. So that's a really common solution as well, to try to help if you have a lot of content editors. There are some, the tools like Site Improve, they're kind of expensive. So if you can't afford that, there are also tools that, there are lots of open source reporting tools. I highly recommend a tool called Pally, PA11Y. It's open source, and they have this great library of stuff. They have a command line tool and all these things, a wide variety, a JavaScript library. But they have something really cool. They have a out of the box dashboard that, it requires some technical setup, but if you can get that set up, and you can use it to, like, give it URLs you want to scan, and then it will scan them for you and give you really basic reporting. So, like, if you're tech savvy enough, you could fork that and add other stuff to it if you wanted. But out of the box, it's a really helpful tool. So there's lots of stuff like that where, that tool is going to catch, most of the stuff that most of the problems that content editors are going to create, with image alts and document structures. It's not going to catch them all, as we've discussed, but it'll catch a lot of them. And what I always encourage people is to take that data, and if you discover that you're having the same problems over and over again, you're having alt attributes missing from every image, or you're having read mores all over the place, then kind of cycle back to the education component. Round up all your content editors and have a meeting, where we talk about, these are the problems we're having and why they're important. And I think kind of a nice cycle of that, over and over again, you can get to a really good space, where you're not just creating, you're not doing all the work to make your website accessible. You're creating a community around it. We One university I was at, we had Site Improve, and we gamified it. Which really worked for us, because tools like that, you can actually give access to the dashboard to people, or you can, like, have emails go out there like, you have 10 problems on your site. And we found that people really liked that competition, and everybody wanted to be 0 problems, and so they would go fix them all, and then we would give out swag. We'd have a monthly meeting of everyone where we would announce who did the most work or whatever, and give out fancy university coffee mugs and whatever. So that was a fun experience, and got people like excited about their website again, which was also nice to see. But yeah, so to kind of wrap that question, I'm bummed that I don't have a better answer. The WordPress space is, as I've mentioned, kind of still struggling in this regard. So hopefully some progress will be made over time.
Yeah, and you would have the same content accessibility challenges whether or not Gatsby is on the front end. It's sort of that experience of working in the WordPress space. But we had some great comments from Caitlin running the Gatsby Twitch, saying content creators can run tools like Axe and accessibility insights on the rendered previews of their content. So no matter how your WordPress site is running, whether it's decoupled or not, that preview experience can be pretty important to give you something to run tools against in the absence of a content checker. And the earlier that you can catch those issues, the better. Like, imagine, if you have this great community education kind of feedback loop where you're educating the people writing content to think of it up front, that can cut down on the amount of time that it might take you to resolve these issues. Whereas if, you ship the content, you might catch it later with an automated tool like Site Improve or Pally or something, but then you have to go back and update that content. And are you even on a contract with those authors anymore? I mean, who's going to do the work? So it's like getting that kind of culture of accessibility up front, I think, is an absolutely winning way to go, kind of no matter what technology stacks you're using. Because yeah, it's sort of, you have to teach people what's important and kind of what's the goal of it, so they can use their human brains and critical thinking skills to know what's important and what can be kind of ignored and that sort of thing if it's not really going to impact a user. So yeah, I think the education way to go is always smart.
Yeah, for me,
um,
from what I've learned, it's not enough to just tell someone, hey, we've got to put alt attributes on stuff. Like, it's not enough. You have to explain why it's important. You have to make them understand like why we're doing this, and try to get them to see it from a user's perspective, because that's going to sink in more, and they're going to remember that more, and then therefore be more likely to actually be on the lookout for it and not do it. um, Another note about the content checking is that it's kind of hard to really just kind of have a content checker like run over the editor before they publish, because yeah, it's fine if your content is inside the editor is all plain, but in WordPress, there's Gutenberg land, in the sense that you know the markup's not always created inside the editor. It's not created until the front end, or in classic editor land, there's short codes, which the markup's not created there. It's created, somewhere else. So it's created on the front end load. So helping educate content editors about how to use preview, how to open up preview, and then how to run browser tools in the preview tab, that, like Axe and WebAIM and Insight Accessibility Insights on Microsoft, and I forget the other one I mentioned. There's a lot now, which is great. Picking one or two of those and educating people how to use them in preview mode is really what's more important, because that's where all of the actual markup will be generated, and these testing tools can have a better chance of actually finding the problems versus the struggle that is pretty common in editor mode.
Gotcha. I'm going to go back through the chat. We got a question earlier about from GoCat saying, "Thanks for explaining the process, Rachel. I often see a phrase minimally accessible. When do you consider a site to be minimally accessible? What are the must-have things when getting started?"
I have never heard that term. I mean,
Minimally
I get the
accessible.
gist. I'm assuming they mean like what's like the minimum you can do to like have it be okay, quote unquote.
Yeah, I guess one thing that comes to mind for me is the web content accessibility guidelines, how there are different levels. So there's level A, level AA, and AAA. And so I think that's probably the maybe healthiest way to think about it, is that you could, making something accessible, maybe the, minimum level of that might factor into, levels of the web content accessibility guidelines, where AAA is kind of going above and beyond in some cases. But compliance doesn't necessarily mean that your website is that usable to people with disabilities. So we always want to make sure we're making stuff that works for people. And so minimally accessible to me sounds a little bit like, what's the bare minimum that we can get away with? And that
Yeah.
kind of misses the point of, like, the goal is to make something that works for humans with disabilities. And so that is really what that looks like is going to depend on your situation. It'll depend on your content, what you're putting on a screen. Once you have those factors coming together, you can evaluate what needs to be improved. Is it color contrast? Is it, parts of the layout that are repeated across things like menu buttons and navigation structures, or is it related to the content? And so I think figuring out what's minimally accessible to make it usable to humans is the way that we should think about it. And so that's typically the way I approach it, is look at what's on these pages. What because not all of, every success criteria in the web content accessibility guidelines, not all of them will necessarily apply, because you might not have all of those scenarios. So of the things that you do have happening on your website, kind of approaching it from, the we talked earlier about manual testing and using your keyboard and browser extensions and screen readers. I think sort of approaching it from like a process standpoint, you can see what actually needs to be improved, and then make some estimates and determine, like, how much time do you think it's going to take to fix this? And that might hint at why doing it earlier is really important, so that you can be planning for it and not going, oh, shoot, we launched this entire website and we didn't think about accessibility at all. How much is it going to cost to fix it? That could be pretty steep. So that's this education piece comes up again, of like, the more we make a culture of it and we consider it all the time, yeah, it becomes less about minimally accessible and more about like making it part of the, just normalize it, make it part of the process for every team. So that's what I'd like to get to, because then it's not this huge lift to fix it all after the fact, and more we can increment and think about it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Like for every part of it too. Like I'm a developer, so I think a lot. And when I'm building something, I am constantly at least running the scan tool over it. Like I'll spend like 30 minutes on it, and then run the tool over to make sure there's not anything glaring that I missed. I'll do a quick, if I'm building something that's heavy functionality, it's like I'll do a quick keyboard test every so often to make sure I'm on the right path. And because yeah, you know the amount of time, you know in my field, it's usually someone launches a site, they realize it's horribly inaccessible, and then they don't fix it because they do the math to fix and realize how much time and money it will cost to fix. And then that's just really heartbreaking. I've had people that have had to hire me for like 6 months, which isn't cheap, to come in and like refactor their entire website because it wasn't accessible. And so the more you can educate and kind of get this ingrained from the get-go, everyone wins. It's easier on everyone and it's more enjoyable. And you know accessibility and a lot of the practices and stuff, they sometimes get sort of a bad rap in the sense, because that is what happened with a lot of devs who didn't know, or didn't think about it. They'll launch, and then in their eyes they just spent a year working on this thing, and they should be celebrating, but now they've probably got to spend 6 months rebuilding it. And that's frustrating, and no one wants to be in that position. So the more we can educate and advocate and keep people from being in that position, the developer wins and all the users win, everyone wins, and it's great. And so um but oh, I was thinking about something that I wanted to share about the minimal stuff. Oh, you touched on it. This idea of kind of compliance versus accessibility. Like there are standards, there's WCAG, and because there are actually lawsuits and things like that, there's definitely, they have to have definitions of accessible for compliance sake, for to go into a courtroom and say, we met WCAG 2.0 AA, so we're good now. But the reality is that just because it's WCAG 2.0 AA, which is generally the common standard, that doesn't necessarily always mean it's accessible, but it covers a lot of it, and you're doing pretty good if you are. So this whole, I don't quite know the person who asked this question what they mean by minimal accessibility, but um, as an accessibility professional and advocate, and I would hope that that everyone would aim to just be accessible and not necessarily aim to only be minimally accessible.
Yeah, or
So
compliant.
yeah, yeah. Like if obviously, like as I mentioned, like if you're compliant, you're probably doing pretty good. But as you've said, Marcy, that's kind of missing the point. And the point is to be accessible and to keep working hard at that, and really understanding your users and what they need, and what it's like for them. I mean, everyone wants people to enjoy using their website. I don't want it to be a frustrating experience. So, figuring out what that means and figuring out what that's like um, for users, and something that I usually will kind of mention in some of my talks is, is when you is the importance of understanding users and doing user testing, because that really ties into a lot of this. And because generally what happens is, if you don't understand the different types of users that are using your technology, you usually end up creating or designing an experience that's really just for people like if you're sighted and you can use a mouse, so you generally out of the box kind of design experiences that really work best for visual consumption and using a mouse. And so the more you can kind of get out of that mindset, the more you can create more beautiful experiences that will kind of go outside that box and be more inclusive and welcoming to anyone else who wants to also use your website. Because another big point that a lot of people generally make is that you don't really usually make your website for you, right? You make it for other people. And so designing it for other people is going to make a better website.
I totally agree. And we got sort of a related question from Andrew Litchford saying, how do you sell the importance of accessibility to coworkers and or clients that don't yet understand the need for putting in the effort? Are there some good resources to point them to? I found one from the W3C on the business case for accessibility, and they break it down into various benefits. I mean, a big one that comes to mind for me, especially talking about higher education and procurement and government, is that if you have an accessible website or accessible digital product, you can sell it to more people. More people can use it. You could be procured by the government. I mean, for big enterprises and organizations, that could really limit the reach of your business. I mean, think of a company like Adobe. They weren't super accessible for a long time, and it became there's a business case there. So organizationally, getting that buy-in, I think you can frame it in various ways depending on who you're talking to. Are you talking to finance people? Talk about the money angle and how much, disposable money that or disposable income that people with disabilities could contribute to your space. If you're talking to legal folks, you could talk about lawsuits and kind of, market examples of pressure that has been put on, say one company gets sued for accessibility and kind of the market pressure that that puts on their competitors. Um, I think depending on who you're trying to convince, you can take these different angles. But that business case for accessibility hopefully can break that down a little bit more. And what I try to think about is the organizations that have been sued are kind of, caught off guard. Well, you shouldn't be, because you should have had lots of warning when people, like, if it gets to lawsuit form, you've likely already been notified about that and you didn't fix it. And that's why it got to that point. It's unfortunate. But I think a better state to be in would be to be more proactive about it, because if you're not like responding to a lawsuit, you can take that time and energy to be more innovative and creative with it. And that, I think, is the awesome place to get to. That for those of us in the technology space, it's like kind of shut off the depressing parts of the ecosystem not being accessible and instead look at it from like, what can we do to make this better? And I'm so thrilled that for those of you that have joined and people who are learning about accessibility, like the more of us that there are, the more that we can actually make it improved. So I'd love to see more emphasis on innovating with accessibility and just making it a natural part of the process so we can make it better instead of this like minimal, I don't know, the sort of like compliance side, which is part of it. But I think we can have a lot more fun with it
Yeah.
than
Well, and
just
if
talking about compliance.
sorry to interrupt, Marcy. I just wanted to jump in with another thing is that I think a lot of people and a lot of developers, but people in general have a very abstract understanding of how people with disabilities like can even use a computer, let alone like a website or a mobile phone or something. And so I would also recommend like showing your coworkers like somebody who's visually impaired using a screen reader, or like how um, like different button devices work for people with physical disabilities, because I think when they sort of see that relationship with like okay, so you have this input of the website or the web browser and this is what it outputs, it just becomes much more real to people in a lot of ways, and they start to understand it and I don't know, concretize the problem more than they could before.
Yeah, we have
Absolutely.
we have this problem on the internet where you don't you're not people, most of the people you're talking to, except these days where everything is a Zoom, most of the time when you're talking with someone, they're not in front of you, and there is very much a disconnect with how others are using the internet, and how that works. Something that I usually will try to point out to people, especially those with like online businesses, is that in the brick and mortar setup, you do have the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, that requires you to make sure that your brick and mortar store is accessible, but we don't have those same guidelines on the internet. And so but I try to get people to imagine, if your site isn't accessible, it's no different from, say, blocking someone in a wheelchair from getting to the cash register. Like, it's try to imagine it like that, and try to envision it more in a physical space, and what that's like, and what you're doing. You're doing the same thing on the internet. When you are using inaccessible functionality and your website isn't accessible to others. Another thing is another recent example is this influx of virtual events. Unfortunately, a lot of these virtual event platforms are inaccessible, in a wide variety of range of problems, but some of them are just like Crowdcast is highly inaccessible. If you can't use a mouse, you pretty much can't join an event unless they fix that over the last like month. Um, it's really inaccessible. And so I tried one way I pointed it out to someone was, it's pretty much the same thing as if you were having an in-person event, but you know, you blocked people in a wheelchair, or anyone that was blind. Like, you basically just said, you can't come to our event. It's really no different from that. But a lot of people on the internet have that disconnect problem where, they it's hard to get outside that mindset of experiences that work for us might not work for others. And so working on that and focusing on that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Well, I think we could keep talking for hours, obviously, but but we are almost at the top of the hour. I know, Rachel, you've got something to promote. I wanted to give you a moment to talk about the conference. On
Oh
speaking
yeah.
of online events.
I was going to share my screen, which I can still do. Where is that at? I think this is the tab. Um, so WP Campus 2020 Online is a WordPress and higher education conference. It is free, obviously online. Uh, so WP Campus usually has two events every year. We have an in-person every July, and we move around every year. We've been in Portland, St. Louis, Buffalo. Next year, we're going to be in New Orleans, which is really exciting. We were supposed to be there this July, but obviously we all know why that's not happening. And so we usually have an online conference in January. we were unable to do it this year, but it worked out. Now we're doing it in July. So in 2 weeks, it's Wednesday and Thursday, July 29th and the 30th. It's completely free. All you have to do is register. Big button up there. And I just wanted to kind of scroll through the schedule. We do have a lot of great talks. It's if you work, especially if you actually use WordPress in higher ed, then obviously this is a conference for you. But we also focus a lot on accessibility. And some of the talks are just very general web development. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a bunch of people that are building websites for a living. So we are very flexible in our range of topics. But I'm really excited for a lot of these. We're going to have a lot of accessibility, like I said, some accessibility testing there with Tim. And um, what I'm also really excited about, something we didn't really talk about, was the Gutenberg accessibility audit, and which could be a future conversation. But there are lots of already talks about that online if you're interested. But to sum it up, WP Campus sponsored an accessibility audit of WordPress's current block editor, and that came out in May of last year. The results came out, and so Joe from the accessibility team is going to come and basically give us an update on what happened after May, and how many changes we saw actually come to the editor and come to WordPress core from that audit. So that'll be really exciting to hear from Joe. But we also have some mobile site testing guidelines session that'll be great. And we're going to talk about decoupled websites. I'm going to talk about it. There's my name. I'm going to talk about the project that I mentioned, the campus project where we moved to a decoupled Gatsby environment. So that'll be great. We're going to talk about making our events diverse. So I'm super excited about that. So yeah, just a lot of really great stuff, website performance. I'm excited about Cliff's talk because it's going to be about change management. So if you use WordPress or any kind of CMS really, and especially in higher ed where you kind of manage a lot of content editors, change management is a really important topic. So that should be a really great talk. And yeah, so join us. It'll be lots of fun. Morton's going to come. This is a talk that Morton's giving at like an event apart. So you can come to our event and hear it for free.
Wow. Yeah.
So
Practical
that'll be
ethics.
great. Yeah. Practical ethics for the modern web designer. So,
Nice. That sounds amazing. Yeah,
yeah.
I think the one question that we did not get to that I will lob to you since you're going to be talking about decoupling was about responsive design. They were asking about WP Campus and mobile responsive site design, which I can say kind of generally and quickly that responsive design is definitely helpful for accessibility. So maybe, I don't know if you have any of that in your decoupled talk, but I know that talking about performance and kind of like why you might decouple your front end from WordPress, mobile could be part of that conversation for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I talked a little bit about the performance gains, from separating our front end from the WordPress application and the benefits that come to that. So that really can come in handy for mobile because you're having so much more control over what assets get loaded and when they get loaded versus you can do these things in the WordPress application. They're just so much harder and they're harder to manage and kind of stay up to date with as you update plugins and stuff. So when you have a decoupled environment, for example, with Gatsby, like you control what exactly goes on the page, and if that changes at all, it's because you changed it. So and not a plugin author. So that can really come in handy with performance on mobile and just including the bare minimum of what's needed, or including only what's needed, excuse me, for your website, which will always make it faster than, example, a CMS, which may kind of CMSs. I think all of them have this problem where your CMSs are this playground where uh, adding modules or plugins or whatever kind of give other developers access to play in your playground, and it's a little harder to manage sometimes of what happens, and it's hard to stay on top of that, and it's hard to kind of manage what changes when you update the plugin, things like that. There's some cool tools coming out for that. I'm excited to see what happens with Staging Pilot. A Staging Pilot was a tool a friend of mine built that's like it's visual integration testing, and so like what it does is that like if you update your plugin, it will take screenshots of the difference on your site and try to give you an idea if anything changed. And I believe Pantheon bought it, so I'm waiting with bated breath to uh, see if they integrate that into their platform. And so there's tools that are helping with that, but otherwise it's a challenge.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for joining us on office hours. I think we are over time, so we're going to call it. But I really appreciate all the questions. And thanks to Caitlin and our captioner. And of course, to you, Rachel, for joining. Yeah, it's been a really good time on the accessibility office hours today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And
Yeah,
thanks for my
everybody.
Gatsby t-shirt.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week on Thursday. And we also have a stream coming up Tuesday at noon Eastern about Blog 2.0. So I hope we see you there. Bye.
Right on.
Ooh,
Have a great day, everybody.